Okay, welcome back to another episode of Data and Sports. We are in episode 14 today, here on March the 10th, 2026. And I am happy to welcome Zach McLean, who has joined us. So, Zach, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Looking forward to having a chat.
Likewise, we have a pretty good agenda from my perspective to cover a range of topics. And ideally, we'll be able to help educate and inspire some athletes as well as data professionals based on your experience and perspective. But before we get into it, in terms of your background, what you're working on, and all that, let me just give the ideal outcome for today's episode, so the audience has a sense of what we're trying to achieve. And so, as I mentioned, we're trying to help empower data professionals to give them a framework of sorts for decision science in sports. That will help them learn how to separate signal from noise in massive athlete monitoring data sets, so big data sets, how to build performance models that coaches can actually trust, and then what it takes to work at the intersection of kinesiology and data science in the NHL. Though we won't necessarily focus so much on specifically the role in terms of what you're doing at the Flames. But we'll make it more broad, so I believe it can be more applicable to others, including your work at McLean Performance, which is your firm, and then the PhD work that you're doing today. So before I ask you to give a little bit more about yourself in terms of your background, how you got to where you are, I actually think that you are the third now current professional in a performance staff at a pro club who was in parallel working on their PhD.
All right,
So
well, that's a few of us.
yeah, that's pretty cool. So we had Whelan Fu, who at the time was at Tottenham Hotspur. He's now Nottingham Forest, and then Luke Jenkinson at San Diego FC. All, and then now yourself, all working your PhD. So I believe that will give folks another fantastic perspective and hopefully some inspiration on you can do a lot at the same time. So before we get into the topics, and as always, we'll end with behind the data to finish. Can you give some background into where you got started, how you might have got interested in terms of data science, like sports science in general, to today in terms of working on your PhD while running your own firm in terms of research, while also working for an NHL team?
Grew up in a small town in Canada called Golden, BC, kind of nearby Banff, if people know where that is. And one of the benefits to growing up in this kind of town was that I got exposed to a lot of different sports and playing sports, but also probably like everybody else listening to this podcast, a big fan of sports kind of growing up, and I still am, of course. So when I started my kind of post high school university career, I was interested in the kinesiology area. And at the time, to be honest, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. I had some different thoughts about physio and maybe med school and all sorts of different things. But something I've always been interested in is understanding athlete performance and kind of working towards this very high level and like specific difficult goal, which is just to optimize athlete performance. So from that perspective, it kind of dove a little bit deeper into the strength conditioning world near the end of my undergrad. And that led me to a whole bunch of different opportunities, but including working. I worked in Edmonton for a little while, working with some general population, doing some training, and then moved to Calgary, Alberta, where I am now in 2019. And that's when I started my master's degree. And I looked at more of an exercise physiology approach and how we should train not only athletes, but also clinical populations for kind of best outcomes. And then during that time, I also started doing some research looking at blood flow restriction training in athletes and fatigue profiles and all sorts of stuff. But a few years ago, I was really lucky to start working with a legend in the field, Dr. Matt Jordan, who I'm sure many of your listeners know or maybe have done his courses before. So I'm doing my PhD now with him, and it's really provided a great opportunity to get more into the data science side of things, which is something I've been interested in a long time and kind of like started looking at a little bit more before my PhD began. But it's, I think, a super interesting area and an area that's kind of pretty new and expanding outwards. So that was really exciting. And like you mentioned, at the same time, I think maybe in 2020, I started interning and then working with the Calgary Flames. This is actually my fourth year with them now. I work in the player development department as a strength coach, where I oversee the kind of the physiological development of our prospect group.
Awesome. And I don't have the data for it I guess I don't have the data on the data in sports of the 13 prior guests, how many grew up playing sports, had some interest in sports, but I believe it's a fair amount. And I think we'll see here today, and speaking with you as we have with others, is having some of that contextual, or maybe more than some contextual understanding of like the sport that you're working on or the athlete that you're working with is super relevant, and how it's not just about analyzing data without that context. But before we jump into it, into some of the main topics, could you give us some insight into on maybe what caused you to also build out McLean performance to like to do your own thing? I just always just curious. Like I really appreciate people that also like do their own work for themselves, want to build something out with like their name to it. And so I'm curious if there was anything that really drove that, or if from your perspective, was just part of like natural progression in terms of your career.
I think there's a little bit of a natural progression. I've always been somebody that, I haven't really pursued it for a while, but I've had like an entrepreneurial sort of mindset for a long time. And McLean Performance is fairly new and something that I'm really excited to kind of get off the ground and then moving forward over the next few years. But what I've found is over the course of maybe the last 2 to 3 years, I've been diving deep into things like machine learning and force play data, and kind of with the broader scope of saying, how can when we're testing athletes and force plates are more prevalent than ever, which is awesome. And we collect so much data on athletes. But I think that what we're missing right now is this important question where we're saying, like, how can we make the most out of the data that we're collecting? And how can we kind of like, it's like the data interpretation bottleneck. And that's something that I've worked a lot towards, and we'll get into it a little bit more later, I think, in my PhD. And I think McLean Performance is just a natural sort of bridge to saying, like, hey, I can probably help a lot of other practitioners make the most out of the data that they're collecting. And there's different, new, and interesting ways to kind of do that. And it's the perfect time for a resource like this, in my opinion. There's, like I said, more data than ever, but the more I talk to people, the more they're saying is that I love that we can get so much data, but there's so much of it, I almost don't know what to do with it. And
Yes.
that's kind of where McLean Performance sits and where I'm really excited to start diving deeper into that with some online courses and working with practitioners directly.
Amazing. Like just genuinely amazing. I mean, I've referenced B2B in my experience and like non-sports in the past, and it's somewhat similar in that there's just so much data, and people think more data is better, not necessarily. And this past weekend, I was at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. It was the 20th version of it. And this was a recurring topic about how it's not just about having more data and just throwing into an LLM. It's understanding how to contextualize it, how to understand, like, is this quality? Is it useful? What you want to do with it? And then even building out proprietary data sets in terms of having some competitive advantage. So with that, you got a nice segue into jumping into the heart of this episode. Let's go like and this is somewhat new in terms of the approach where I'm giving like themes to the various topics that we go through. But let's talk about that, like tons of data, but around quality and quantity, or quality over quantity. So you just mentioned how there's so much data, right? There, in some cases, there could be millions of data points across a team in terms of what's being collected. And if when you take into consideration the time series, right, there's just a lot of data to analyze. As you mentioned, force plates, there's a lot of new wearables that are coming out, that have existed, that are coming out, will continue to come out. That gives us a lot of different perspectives, I guess, or different points of view. And so, how do you think about this in terms of the notion of quality and quantity? You somewhat alluded to it just now in terms of the interpretation of it and what you do with it. Though, like, is there too much data almost? And what are some of the things that we should consider before we even start collecting data on athletes or for teams in terms of the athlete monitoring in the context of performance?
I think that's a tricky question. I'm not sure if I can say whether there's too much data or not enough data, but I do think that it depends on the context that you're looking at it. Well, I agree. As an example, after you do, say, a single jump on force plates and you do a single counter movement jump on force plates, you might get dozens or maybe 50 different outcome metrics, depending on. And I think as humans, we're very good at pattern recognition. in general. Like if you're a strength coach and you see 100 athletes come into your gym, over time you start grouping those athletes into different buckets. You might say this athlete needs to work on their strength. And then this athlete, they also need to work on their strength, but they also need to work on maybe some movement capacities. Or a different athlete's very strong and they have a sort of like a different set of characteristics that define and different deficits that need to be worked on. And we do this intuitively all the time. I talk to physios lots of the time, and they're saying the same thing. They say, oh, I'm getting better at identifying shoulder injuries because I just seen more of them. And as a result, I start seeing patterns in these shoulder injuries. So intuitively, humans are very good at pattern recognition, but what becomes extremely difficult is doing that in or with data, especially when we start going beyond maybe 2 or 3 or 4 metrics and start talking, like you were mentioning before, in the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of metrics. And then go on top of that and talk about longitudinal data, and maybe you're dealing with hundreds of athletes as well. And those data sets become extremely large really quickly. So I don't think it's a question of do we have too much data, but I think that we maybe need new tools to start helping, like maybe take advantage of the tools that exist in different fields, like medicine as an example, and apply them to our environment to get a little bit better of an understanding about how athletes perform and what sort of patterns exist in those data. But before we get started at all, of course, like you were alluding to, is that we need to make sure that the data that goes into our big data systems is a very high quality of data. So I think you can have a high quality and a high quantity. And that just depends on some like basic foundations before you get started. Obviously, you should care about the reliability and the validity of the metrics that you're collecting. And if you're using force plates, you should care about the surface that your force plates are on and what sort of tests and your cueing conditions and all these different like fundamental things. And once we have the fundamentals right, then we can add these cool and new layers on top of it to kind of help us analyze it and understand it a little bit better.
Okay, so I like that point of view in that there might not necessarily be too much. It depends on and how you use it and if you have the capacity. And I kind of came at it from in my conversations, online in terms of these episodes and even offline. I tend to hear things like, well, we have so much information that we collect and we don't necessarily know what to do with it. Or there's too many outputs. And it could be the case that in their situation, it's more around the system and how they're contextualizing the data, perhaps analyzing it, perhaps asking the right questions or relevant questions, and then actually making it actionable to know what to do with it. So it's one of those like I guess lawyer answers of it depends, which is very true in the real world, which we'll get into in a little bit and some of the constraints that exist. And and then you also have something that has come up, conference to conference I've been to, especially in football, like soccer in America, is around injuries and how people search for to understand why does this happen? Like, why do ACLs rupture? And I think as humans, we also want simple answers, but complex problems usually have complex answers. So is that something that you're seeing more and more in your research and the practical work that you do? Is that as we get more experience in certain areas of performance, we realize like single metric tracking doesn't give us the full picture because a lot of these issues or challenges are like multifactorial. And so therefore we require more complex systems and more data to get a full understanding of what's actually happening as opposed to, well, it's this one singular, I guess, myopic data point.
100%. And that's like sport performance and injury, both independently, but kind of similarly, are these complex, dynamic, recursive, and oftentimes just unpredictable systems. We already know this. If you're a fan of hockey or any other sport, you're watching a play happen and you can understand how unpredictable and chaotic those environments are. So then if you try to add a layer on top of it and saying, hey, I'm going to try to, with all the data available, predict what team is going to win. And so that should maybe be the easiest thing to predict oftentimes. And you really can't do it with a lot of certainty. So the same thing applies when we're looking at something like force plate data or with athlete performance data or tracking data. And it's like if you have a lot of data, you're probably getting provided that that data has some sort of physiological or biomechanical backing, you're probably starting to get more and more information about the metrics or the systems that define that environment. But The problem is like you said, when you start looking at those metrics in isolation, as an example, if all I looked at was jump height plotted over time, I'm really missing a lot of the other interactions that happen in those environments. And probably like the vast likelihood is that those interactions are going to be highly complex and they're going to be non-linear interactions that are sort of unpredictable in and of themselves. So I think that, that's something where I've used machine learning recently to start looking at that sort of question and starting to look at more complex, multidimensional pattern recognition as a potential solution to those sort of problems.
So normally I ask this question at the end around what advice you would give. So based on what you mentioned machine learning a couple times, and now I'm curious where this came from, if it wasn't like the schoolwork, practical work, your own interest. But like if you could look at, I guess we'll frame it this way. If you can give the yourself 5 years ago or 10 years ago advice, or you could be speaking to a current student, maybe undergrad, maybe a high school that has an interest in this. What are some of the things that you would have paid more attention to, maybe from the modeling or statistical perspective or data perspective, that a current student today should perhaps be paying attention to? Because then we'll come back to the end in terms of like predictions for the future and the frontier. But any sort of advice you could give off the bat, so to speak, to folks?
I don't want to position myself as a statistical expert because probably lots of the people listening to this will have a much better understanding of stats than I do. What I do understand is I understand how we can use more complex models in combination with our practical experience and knowledge of different strength professionals or maybe rehab professionals or so on and so forth. And what I think is for advice, I think that maybe people should just become as multifactorial in their experience as possible. Probably maybe things are changing now because AI is making things a lot easier for everybody in terms of coding. But one of the best things that I did in 2019 is that I taught myself how to code. And that became a real game changer in terms of the doors it opened up for me in sports science and the opportunities that came along with that. So now it's like I had a coding experience and then I added on top of that some machine learning. And along with that, I already had a lot of strength conditioning knowledge and knowledge of sport environment and how those things interact together. And I think that that's how you sort of make the most of your data really at the end of the day. If you have, and there's people with lots more skill sets than I have, and they just become more and more powerful in the way that they can look at things. The kind of, I think if you start looking at saying, oh, I only understand sport and I'm going to, dabble in the data, then I think that is an opportunity to expand those skill sets or possibly collaborate with other people that have like a different set of skills.
No, for
I'm not sure
sure.
if that made sense.
100%. I mean, again, I don't have the data on the data in sports on this of how many times episode one guest Darcy Norman has been referenced. I'm going to paraphrase him again because it's super relevant. When he mentioned his experience of how somebody had said to him, you have broad range or broad level competency, and that has value. You just gave another example of that, of having like a range of competencies and understandings has a lot of value, which actually I believe is a nice segue into the next topic, we'll say, or section, with the theme of like real world constraints. Because in a vacuum, this can seem, though complex, quite simple. But as we know, when we work in a team environment with other people, there are some potential constraints from how we communicate to limitations in terms of time or budget or availability of resources or what have you. So let's go into that. And we don't necessarily need to have it so specific as to an NHL season, though, as had discussed with Kevin Neal of the Boston Bruins in a prior episode, this NHL season is just wild in terms of how condensed it is. There's some real constraints here with the Olympic break that just happened. But I believe that this can apply to an NBA season, MLB season, NFL season, college sports, or what have you. There's a reality in terms of how we can not necessarily just build the frameworks, but effectively action on them, right? So let's go into a couple areas and give folks more examples of what it is that I'm alluding to, referring to. When we talk about working with, and we're not, I guess to be clear, we're not being specific here in any certain situation or making this broad for the purposes of giving the examples. If you are working with an athlete, developmental player or what have you, and you are doing their measurement in terms of training, maybe preseason, during season, to make sure that they're fit to play. Right? We call this return to play, as folks know. How do you communicate and deliver these sorts of pieces of advice or decisions to a player or a coach or a general manager or whomever, where you're also appreciating that they're not necessarily looking at it from the data perspective, because the other step might use the eye test as it's known. How do we marry those together to get to the ideal outcome for everybody involved, given that sort of a setup of multiple stakeholders?
Yeah, I think that that's a cool and fun challenge in a lot of ways, right? Is that we all probably agree that data has an important role in understanding performance, but in this case, or your example, return to sport or return to performance as well. And we know that there's a lot of practical knowledge and skill sets, like I mentioned, physios or medical staff getting more knowledge and they're doing their own pattern recognition for different injuries. But we do also know that, say, as after an ACL injury, we can expect that athletes will not return to their performance trajectory. So that means in the NHL, after an ACL injury, you're likely to have fewer goals, maybe fewer assists, like shorter career length. Or in the NBA, you're going to have a shorter career length and you're going to have a worsened efficiency rating as well. So this is like extremely impactful and something that we can dive a little bit deeper into and start understanding where data fits into that. And one of the things that is pretty important, and is why we use force plates to look at neuromuscular performance in athletes, is this idea of neuromuscular performance and how that fits into return to sport. But like I mentioned before, these are really complex and have a lot of different interacting and probably nonlinear effects. So what Matt Jordan and I have been working on over the past few years is that we've been working on making a practitioner friendly machine learning based approach that will help us answer some of these questions. So I'll give you an example. If you took a big group of male athletes as an example, and maybe they're all from the same sport or from different sports, you'd have an athlete jump on force plates. And the first question that they have for you, and they look at their report and they say, that number, is that good? And you're like, wow, it's just like a pretty simple question. Also, probably the hardest question to answer. You're like, I don't know, good compared to what, or good for who, or good for what position. It really depends, and it's extremely complicated. So what we did was we started working towards that idea, but not just looking at one metric, looking at the pattern of performance that they express across multiple different capacities and multiple different metrics and strength and power and plyometric function all at the same time. So we used machine learning, which in this case is really just pattern recognition at scale. It's what coaches are already doing, but we're saying, hey, it's pretty hard to do pattern recognition if you have 100 metrics. So we're going to use a machine to help us out a little bit. And you can start identifying these groups of athletes that have similar characteristics and are oftentimes maybe sport specific or in different instances, sex specific as well, or maybe position specific, depending on how you analyze the data. And from that information, it really provides a goldmine of opportunities to look at something like return to sport. Because if you imagine, I say, hey, I have a football lineman and this is the profile, and it's like this group of data points that describe everything about them, or as much about them as we can measure. And there's different metrics in there, and there's some that are more important, some that are less important. And what's important for a lineman is probably not important for a wide receiver, or vice versa. And you can have a lineman profile, and then I can take a new lineman who's maybe returning after ACL injury, and I can plug them into our machine learning algorithm and say, okay, what do they look like relative to their target profile? So we know that these are high performing linemen. There's maybe some low performing linemen too in a different profile. We don't want them to look like that. We want them to look like the high performing lineman. So we're saying, hey, where do you look like that profile based on your weighted combination of characteristics? And if you do, or if you don't, what are the top 10 reasons why? And this because this starts going from, hey, you just collected all this data and it's impossible for all of us to make a big, like grand interpretation of it oftentimes, but even harder when you're talking to somebody that's not as familiar with the data.
Mhm.
But it becomes very, very feasible and very practitioner friendly as if I give you a report and you say, hey, here are the top 10 things that matter from all that testing that we did. We collected hundreds of data points, and here's the top 10 things that matter. And here, look, three of them are really helping that athlete look like their target profile. So we're doing really well in those three categories. And seven of them are holding them back. And oftentimes in those seven, there's a theme. So we're saying, oh, it's single leg capacities, or maybe it's plyometric function. But on the other hand, they're doing really well at maximal strength. So because it goes beyond just looking at single metric in isolation, it uses a nonlinear approach that's highly complex, but we can distill it down to just 10 metrics. And I think that that's like a really powerful way where we can go from, hey, we should and do collect a lot of data on athletes, but now we can take all that data and, for our sake and for everybody else's sake, distill it down to the top 10 things that matter most. And it's like an actionable report that you can give to anybody right away and say, okay, this is what you need to be training next week. And then, you can do that repeatedly over time. And hopefully the things that you're training are starting to improve. And then the things that, there's a new metric that might pop up and say, hey, okay, now we need to focus a little attention on this one. And as we move towards, we can kind of track that athlete moving towards their profile. And at some point say, wow, they're really well within that profile. And we've done a great job. And this athlete has returned to performance, not just returned to their sport.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that actually, in terms of your thoughts on the notion of air quotes return to performance, because you hear about return to play, but if we just use the example recently here in Boston, of Jason Tatum, who just returned from an Achilles, and there was this question of like, is he going to be the player he was before? It's like an obvious answer might be absolutely not. It doesn't work that way. I mean, you just alluded to that with hockey players and ACL injuries. So then I believe it's just like the fan expectation, perhaps even the athlete's expectation is like, well, no, I'm going to come back and be the same person. That's like that's who I am. I'm an NBA star, and perhaps Jason will. He's only come back for 2 games so far, but that is to me a curious like reframe of this whole topic is like return to performance. Because if you're, I would imagine that, so, for example, if it happens in your when you're 34 versus 26, you should expect a difference or some delta in terms of like percentage to 100% that you're back to what you're performing prior. Like, have you seen any of that in any of your research or work, or is that more of like the theory and it's not quite observed?
No, 100%. There's a lot of evidence that the vast majority of the evidence that looks at athletes returning to their previous performance, or what their performance trajectory would have been had they not got injured, shows that there's a long-term deficit after you return to sport. And that's not to say that we're returning to sport in a poor way. That's just to say that there's a larger continuum that is often ignored. So you had an injury, you have a return to sport, maybe at some point you have a return to competition. But after you return to sport, oftentimes you get a check mark and everybody says, oh, you're good to go. And then, we forget about you and we treat you like a normal athlete. But the new evidence and the vast majority of that evidence would suggest that you're not a normal athlete yet. And there's a long time, maybe another 3 to 5 years before you start looking like yourself, in the athletes that do kind of return to their performance trajectory. And one of my great friends, Nate Morris, he has a couple of papers looking at this as well. And he starts saying, like, hey, we used to think that alpine skiers were maybe the exception to that rule. And alpine skiers would return to sport, but also quickly and easily return to their previous performance level. And what he's found is that it really depends on how you measure performance, which in racing sports is maybe a little bit easier to do in comparison to hockey, as an example.
Yeah.
And he is saying, like, hey, you know what? If we look at athletes who are healthy and how many of them are going to improve, or what's their performance trajectory looking like, and then we look at the performance trajectory of a similar group, but they have ACL injuries, and what their performance trajectory would have been had they not got injured, what we can tell is that, there's maybe whereas like maybe 50 to 60% of the control athletes and the healthy athletes are improving during that time frame. Only a handful of athletes with ACL injury are improving. So, the alpine skiers, they returned to their previous competition level, but they still struggle just like all the other groups, all the other sports to get back to that performance level that they had before. So it's just like the new area that I think that a lot of people are starting to research and care about and apply into practice is not what happens after the return to sport. How can we, start transitioning athletes a little bit more towards the high performance end of the rehab scale?
And I'd imagine, I mean, I'm not a high performing athlete, never was. I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. There must be a whole host of questions from their perspective, like the collective staff and team's perspective, through the lens of behavioral psychology. Meaning, how do you mentally prepare the athlete for this through the process and kind of get them across the hurdle, or I guess across the line, or get them going again? Is there anything that you found in terms of experience or research? It could be like sport differences, gender differences, what have you, where there's different profiles of athletes from like a mental perspective and like their approach and perhaps like I guess, psychological readiness as a part of this? Or is that something not, again, not quite something from your experience you've looked into?
Yeah, I looked into this a little bit. I'm definitely not a sports psychologist for sure. But what we do know is that when we talk about athlete performance, we should use what's called a biopsychosocial approach. So we should care about their biology, we should care about their psychology, and we should care about the social factors that influence their performance. And in this case, you can just duplicate that and say their return to performance as well. And that's kind of an important area because oftentimes what we do is that we care so much about the biology and the neuromuscular function and the tendon rehab or whatever your injury is that we forget about this psychological aspects as well. And it's something that pops up over and over again about return to sport readiness and how athletes are psychologically ready to deal with the demands of their sport. Similarly, I wasn't a really high performing athlete at any point. I would have loved to be, but it wasn't the psychology holding me back, unfortunately. But there's a lot of different ways that we can assess the psychology of an athlete. And I think at the end of the day, when we start getting information about their neuromuscular function and their biology and their psychology, maybe through different scales and surveys, and their social environment, also maybe through different surveys. Then we start filling in big important buckets and start getting a bigger, better picture about what's influencing that athlete's function and what's influencing them or holding them back from success in whatever their scenario is.
No, for sure. I mean, like this has been mentioned, I think, on prior episodes. And then there was at least one panel on this kind of topic and how it was framed at this MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, where you have the expression or the name human performance. And I believe Luke Jenkinson and I went into this quite a bit because I was also asking him like at San Diego FC, like what are the differences when you communicate to the footballers at the academy level versus perhaps the first team because they're different age groups. And it's at the end of the day, it's a people-based business. So I'll come back to a question I had asked previously in terms of kind of advice you could give. Again, you could look at it from the lens of like yourself 5, 10 years ago or what have you, or perhaps other students who are, let's say the ones that are getting very heavy into the data analysis. Let's say they're very advanced in these tools. What kind of advice or point of view do you have for them in terms of the soft skills or like communication skills in terms of working with different stakeholders with a team, like the athlete included?
Yeah, I think that really at the end of the day, if you can't that data is super important, but if whatever your output is from the data, if you can't communicate that to the different stakeholders, that being athletes and medical staff and strength staff and so on and so forth, and if you don't understand the environment, including the athletes on an individual level, then you're probably missing a very important element to make your data successful. So I'm big on I love the data side of things. I think it's super important, but as much as I love the data, I think that, I'm probably a coach first, and I try to integrate that kind of mindset into my practice and the way that I work with people and athletes as well. Is that then you can have this really nice combination of factors where you can use cool and interesting ways to look at the data that are probably very helpful and impactful, but if you have the bridge to also understanding people as people and understanding the environment that they're in and how we can best communicate those data findings, then I think that then you're starting to really address the problems really well. And then you're probably missing the boat a little bit if you kind of miss that middle section.
No, I appreciate that. That's come up a couple times with other practitioners in terms of like, and I'm going to generalize across the board, broad brush stroke, which is not fair. Though, in a way to summarize it, is that if you're just really good at creating graphs and charts and not helping explain why and helping like persuade folks to understand the why to then take action, it's like you said, you're kind of missing out. And I believe from again what I hear from practitioners, even offline, is like they're like that's an area we need to just do a better job on. Is like we know we have so much data, like we know the science behind this, and yet we struggle to or don't do the best job we believe we should be doing in terms of communicating with especially the athlete at the end of the day. And so appreciate that feedback and advice because it just reiterates the point of again, it's people helping people. It's a person based business. You have to understand, and, in my words, like what are the incentives of the different stakeholders? A coach might care first and foremost about winning. That's how they keep their job. A GM might be looking a little bit more long term. Medical staff is protecting the health and well being of the athlete wants to play, or maybe they feel a little hesitant, but their family member is like, what are you doing? Why aren't you out there? What's happened? Like you said, it's my words, 360 view to take into consideration, not just looking at the data to get to, that mutually beneficial outcome for everybody, which is easier said than done, right?
A
Easier said
hundred
than done.
percent. I've been really lucky to work with, I think, 3 or 5 really, really elite practitioners in our field over the course of the last several years. And what I've noticed is that, to me, in my opinion, what separates these different people, these like elite practitioners stand out is that they can take these very complex problems, whether it's exercise physiology principle or the output from a complex machine learning model, and distill that down, well, not keeping all the nuance, but distill it down to something that's extremely understandable for somebody that's maybe not even in our field at all. And that I think is a super impressive skill and probably is maybe the first and most important thing to start bridging that gap between our communication with athletes and different stakeholders that have different goals and whatever else.
I'm with you, and that applies to like any field, any industry. This is like a life skill that is almost like a superpower if, to your point, you're able to develop it very well. So appreciate that insight. Before we get into the behind the data segment, let's go into some predictions or what your thoughts are in terms of what to look out for in the future, perhaps in the topics of AI, biomechanics, and what have you. But I want to kind of frame it this way. Again, I'm tying back to this conference from this weekend and like all the research that's also going on in addition to what you're doing. With all the data technology and research that exists, like, are we currently, air quotes, living in the future? Or if not, what is the next frontier with respect to performance, turn to play, return to performance that folks should perhaps look at? Again, through your lens in terms of what you're saying.
I'm personally somebody that just finds this AI revolution that we're having right now quite interesting, just from a personal standpoint. So, if we're living in the future right now, it seems that every day there's a new future and there's a new thing that's happening. And it's amazing how fast things are moving right now. So, I don't know what's in the future. And probably, I think that there's probably a few people that do. But my guess is that AI is going to be a big part in the way that we look at data and understand data. And I think it's exciting. And there's a lot of opportunities for this. Even as an example, in the last, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years, something like markerless motion capture is really taken leaps and bounds. And if you think about this from an athlete monitoring standpoint, there's a lot of constraints in, especially in pro sport environments, but in every environment. And you might not be able to get athletes to jump on force plates every day like you theoretically might want them to. So markerless motion capture combined with tracking data and all these other really interesting opportunities to analyze what athletes are really doing in their sport and in their specific environment. I think that's going to create these big data sets that we're going to have a lot of opportunities to. And it's kind of like we're able to track and monitor athletes without having them as much do a task like jumping. So maybe if we could understand how they're producing force and how they're moving while they're skating, that's a great step in the right direction because then we get a little bit more time frequency in the data that we are collecting. So that's one area I think that's interesting. AI, I think, is going to be a big game changer moving forward. Like I mentioned before, now AI does a better job at coding than most professional coders do. So probably you don't need to understand how to code as much, but you might what might start differentiating people is people who understand how to use AI in specific environments. And then as a result, understanding the sport environment becomes a real superpower as provided that you can also kind of capture AI in a way that helps you take steps forward and kind of accomplish the goals that you have. So it's uh it's going to be crazy over the next few years, I imagine, but I would imagine that these are starting to make their way into the professional and elite sport very quickly. And even like I said, machine learning being probably a big one as well.
100%. I mean, like, actually, the two things you mentioned about markerless motion capture, because this is using like computer vision, correct?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
computer vision.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
that and like AI as an assistant for coding came up over and over again. Daryl Morey of the Philadelphia 76ers on a panel was not pleading, but almost pleading with folks to start using one of these tools to learn how to code yourself, to like build out your own things and or have some understanding because it's so simple. And then using the markerless motion capture via computer vision to create these models of athletes came up a couple times. And actually, Angela Ruggiero, so Olympic medalist, gold medalist for women's ice hockey for U.S. team, predicted that in under 10 years, each athlete, even at the non-pro level, have a digital twin of themselves based on this technology. And I was like, holy smokes, like this is the future in terms of what we're living in. So yes, those are two prevalent ones as well in terms of what folks said to look out for in terms of elite performance. And no, so do appreciate that. And I'm with you there. It's like if you can understand how to use the technology so it's like accretive or like it builds onto what you're doing, that's great. I find on the flip side, there's a lot of noise compared to Signal in terms of folks, I guess, especially on LinkedIn and other social media where there's just a lot of almost nonsense in terms of like applicability. I believe that's partly for the algorithm, but in terms of like practical applications, in this case, like to benefit people, those are ones that I've heard of as well. So do appreciate that and agree. It is very fascinating stuff at how fast it is going and changing.
Yeah, 100%. It's moving fast right now and it's exciting. There's all sorts of new things happening every day. So it's funny you mentioned the digital twin because I've had some conversations with some different machine learning experts and they do that in agriculture already. And they're saying, and his thought is, yeah, why don't we have that for athletes? We collect enough data on them. You have all your monitoring data and you theoretically could pop your iPad open and see everybody's different headshot and understand what their status is. And then go and kind of have more specific interactions with athletes as a result. So it's at the end of the day, it doesn't replace the human element because you still have to have those. We're still dealing with people, and you still have to have those important conversations. And you know, and have that level. But at the same time, it can maybe start making some of your interactions more targeted potentially, or just provide you with a better or more powerful way to interpret the data that we're already collecting.
No, 100%. I'm with you there. It is interesting. 'Cause I believe Jesse Green had mentioned this too, how we can learn from other industries. Like you mentioned, humans, we are really good at pattern recognition. I think we look outside the box, outside of the boxes that we're working in on a daily basis. You can really learn from other industries. And I had heard of like computer vision being used in forestry and agriculture as well. And I was like, that's not real. And now people are talking about digital twin for humans. Maybe I should say that's not real though. It is. So, speaking of going fast, in the interest of your time, which is really appreciated, let's go to the last segment or the only named segment behind the data. This is the same for all guests in that we go rapid fire with a set of 4 questions with the intention to get an understanding of like, who is this person, right? We started with you in terms of your background, did a really nice deep dive in terms of the work based on your research and practical experience, giving folks advice and we like to finish off in a kind of a fun way as well. So, in no particular order, is there like a comfort food that you have or something that's just like a go to for you that you really appreciate? And if you want to share why, you can.
I like kinda like switching it up a little bit. You know, for me, I love a good pizza. There's a few pretty good places around Calgary for that. And here, I'll give a little shout out to Rocky Mountain Bagel Co., which is a kind of a sandwich place in Banff and, in Canmore, and that's a really good place. I enjoy going for kind of bagels and kind of those type of sandwiches, which is always a good stop on my way into BC.
Awesome. I love the local shout outs because it gives me a list of places to go to. So kind of segueing in terms of a place or location, is there a place that is either like near or far that is just very special to you for any particular reason?
I would say kind of everywhere near Calgary is pretty nice. I grew up in that small town I was talking about before is pretty close to Calgary. So I spend a lot of time traveling between Calgary and Golden. It's about a 3 hour trip. And if you haven't made that trip before, it goes through some really spectacular views and through the Rocky Mountains. So you can stop at Lake Louise and go skiing or see the lake and then go skiing in Golden as well, which is pretty awesome. So I think that those are that whole area is a pretty important one to me.
I really appreciate that. They are and have been on my list to get out to that area, like Banff, Lake Louise. Have been to the Saddle Dome, which I really appreciated to see it as is before it gets redone. So I will again add that to my list. Next, in terms of music, is there a song that puts you in a good mood or gets you focused or pumped up for any particular reason?
You know what? My girlfriend would make fun of me right now, but my music choices are maybe like that of an old man. So I either listen to podcasts, which I do frequently, or right now I'm listening to a lot of the Tragically Hip. But any kind of old school rock for me is a good choice.
It's again, it's just. I mean, I've said this before. It's for me, it's just fascinating to get a sense of what people are into, and others will see like I like that too. Like that person is kind of like me, or we have similar interests, and it's okay if folks make fun of us for what we like. It's all good. Okay, last but not least, to wrap up, is there a book that you've read lately, or what's a book you've read lately, maybe the last year or two or so, that's had an impact on you or taught you a lesson that you want to share with others?
Yeah, you know what? I actually read a really great book not too long ago when I was starting my business and doing a little bit more stuff online. And that book is called The Art and Business of Online Writing by Nicholas Cole. And it was recommended to me, and I thought it was a really great, pretty nice read, a pretty easy read, but it had a whole bunch of great insights that, you know, as somebody that writes for a living essentially throughout my PhD and my master's, it would have been pretty beneficial for me to have read that a few years ago as well.
I'm definitely adding that to the list because my online rating not so good, which is a different story. But I am with you there in terms of very useful skill to have for folks. So with that, Zach, thank you so much again for taking the time. This has been awesome, and again, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Mike. Thanks for having me. Let's do it again sometime.
100%.